Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
We've spent a lot of time kind of beating around the bush with some guests. We said we were going to go into a season all about church history, and we got a little derailed. God had some other plans, and we ended up getting to meet with Dr. David De Silva and Albert, and we've just now regrouped. We had a major hurricane come through Florida, and here we are. We're ready to jump into church history, starting in the Old Testament.
Yes, the very beginning of the Old Testament, in fact, all the way in Genesis.
Yay.
Since we're starting in Genesis, there are a lot of subjects in Genesis that are controversial today amongst a lot of Christians, that are triggers for a lot of debate. Not the least of which, is Genesis meant to be taken as literal history? If so, how much of it? Is all of it literal history? Do we start history at Abraham? Because God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even if we consider all of it to be literal history, how much interpretation goes into that literal history? How much of it is right? How much of it is wrong? Do we have to believe all of it is right?
And how much of the structure of Christian religion was established in Genesis? Mm-hmm. Like, how much influence does the early books of Moses have over the church itself?
Mm-hmm. And even calling them the books of Moses is a little bit contentious, because there are a lot of people who claim that Moses didn't actually write them.
Yeah, so there's this documentary hypothesis, or JEPD, on the Torah. So the books of Moses.
What is JEPD?
So essentially there's supposedly 4 different composers of Torah. There's the J strain, so anytime you see like Jehovah or J names for God, that is going to be the J, like the L, Elohim is E, and so forth. So it would be just different editors of the Torah.
Mm.
So it's a theory basically that there are multiple different writers and each of them use different names for God, more or less?
More or less, yes. And then certain sections are composed in certain ways. And I think it used to commonly, I think in the 80s, be called JEDP. And then they added more supposed authors, and now it's just the document hypothesis.
Mm.
Should we even care about the authorship of Genesis or the books of Moses? Does it play a big enough role for us to care that much if it's really written by Moses?
When the New Testament authors and the apostles affirm a Moses authorship of the Torah and I believe the Old Testament itself as well. Yeah.
So where do the New Testament authors affirm that Moses was the author?
They call it like the law of Moses. So anything regarding the laws, like 620 laws that were created in the Old Testament are pretty much all ascribed to Moses.
Sure, but Moses could have been the one who received all of that and then passed it on to other people who then wrote it down.
So as a scribe type of thing?
Yeah. And for me, honestly, I'm not all that hurt if that's what it turns out to be, because that's ultimately what happened in much of the New Testament. Paul does specifically not write his own letters. He actually lets us know when he is writing a greeting in his own hand. He did have scribes that were working with him. And Hebrews is frequently argued to have been from Paul and was written by someone else, written down by someone else, possibly Luke or possibly Barnabas or whoever you think it is. It's not really as important to me who writes down the things. It's that if what they're writing down is accurate and if the source of that writing is true. So was Moses truly inspired when he gave this information which scribes eventually wrote down? Assuming that's what happened. It's also possible that Moses just wrote everything himself. That would be strange considering part of the writings includes Moses' death. But he was a prophet, so that's also not impossible.
Yeah, that's the, I think, starting argument is, how did Moses write about his own death? And there's definitely editors that compiled scripture and put it together. But as far as authorship, it's not something I put too much thought behind as far as Moses needing to have put pen to paper, so to speak.
Yeah. Whenever we're talking about the messages of the Bible, let's say that I am witnessing to someone and I say, if you speak out loud, if you say that Jesus is God and you genuinely believe it deep within yourself, then you will be saved. I've just said something that is written down in the Bible. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. I didn't quote it word for word. And even that translation is a translation of Greek, which is most likely a translation of Aramaic, because these people generally didn't speak Greek. They spoke Aramaic because they were Jews. Also, thank you, Albert. But because there's multiple layers of translation, we're not getting the literal words that were given. And in truth, a lot of the times when the disciples in the New Testament were writing things down, they're not writing down word for word what Jesus said, literally, because they probably didn't have photographic or eidetic memories for everything that was ever said.
What, you mean the red letters in the Bible are not the literal words of Jesus?
No, it's possible they might be, but probably not. They probably did paraphrase things that Jesus said. But let's say that they didn't. Regardless, let's say that they wrote everything in their original letters down perfectly, and they were supernaturally blessed to have perfect memories of everything that Jesus said. We're still left with a situation where we translated it into Greek, and then it was translated into English somewhere along the line, after being copied multiple times by other people. So interpretation is involved somewhere in here. The question is, the original message still present in what we have in our hands as the Bible today? And yes, I would argue absolutely. And I think there are a lot of people who get lost in the weeds as far as authorship and how many times things changed hands. The question is, the message there correct? And I would say yes.
I can't argue with that.
Maybe you could.
What about you?
I'm in agreement. It's not make or break for me for the book to be written by Moses. When I think about, if I just sit and appreciate how old this text is and how many generations it had to get transferred through, I'm just thankful it exists. Like the fact that it's so complete and aligned with God's will and what we know to be true about the Lord, and consistent generationally with what we have from scriptures outside of the Mosaic times. Like I trust it and I love it and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, I believe the Bible itself at its earliest writing point, it's 3,500 years old.
I mean, I know.
I think something around there.
Yeah, I think the early Exodus is around the 1500 BC.
So you're right, Gina. It is obscenely old. Like, it's ridiculous how old this document is. And considering how rare it is for us to find anything from that long ago, the fact that we have these treasures preserved in jars of clay, as it turns out.
Man, 90s band flash movie.
As it is written in the Bible too. So yeah, that's authorship aside and who specifically wrote it. It is something that is ridiculously old that has been passed on to us in the Holy Scriptures, regardless of who specifically wrote it and whether or not we know exactly who. But then we move on to, is it meant to be taken literally? And this is something that has become very contentious for modern Christians, because the very popular position today is, no, it's not meant to be taken literally. Now, I know a lot of Christians who take that position, and I've known a lot of Christians who don't take that position. First question I think we should ask is, does it matter? One, to salvation, and two, does it actually just matter at all?
Take it literally. I don't know. I guess you would have to tease that one out more on.
Yeah, there's so many different stories in Genesis. So is it Genesis as a whole you don't take literally, or is it just certain parts?
We can go really any direction. For one, let's say that you are selective in the things that you take literally in Genesis, that you say, you know what, I don't believe that there were 6 days of creation. And then maybe there's other people who say, okay, maybe there was 6 days of creation, but there's just not very much archaeological evidence to support the really early stuff, which would be a weird position to hold. But let's say that there's any part in Genesis where you just say, you know what, I'm not sure. Are you no longer a Christian at that point?
No. Well, if that's the case, then I'm no longer a Christian.
There are so many parts in just the like Eden story, like the Adam and Eve, where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what to say about this. It's confusing, especially thinking about the divine council and just the way that the serpent is represented. There's a lot of confusing things there. And I could see that being challenging for people. But the good news is it doesn't have an impact on my salvation.
Even setting aside uncertainty, because there are things we're uncertain of in the Bible all the time. There's been a huge push for people to say, actually, it's objectively not meant to be taken literally. And if you think it's meant to be taken literally, you're stupid.
I don't know. Looking at church history and as hermeneutics follows church history, it is the pendulum swing. We talk about it in politics a lot. You get the liberal side, conservative side, and it's just a big pendulum. And it's the same with hermeneutics. We go through super crazy dispensational literal phases, and then there's this abstract allegorical reading of the Bible, and we're definitely in one of the peaks, or heading towards the peak of the allegorical in America today, for sure.
There are people like Kent Hovind, he's a Christian apologist, and he's vehemently defended the literal interpretation of Genesis. And he's made the point in the past, I don't know if he still holds to this, but he's made the point that he believes that people who do not take a literal view of Genesis are not saved.
Huh.
And
That's
man, when
aggressive.
did he start deciding people's salvation?
we do have to admit that there are certain things that we do, like mountains we do need to die on. Things that we do have to hold as sacred as certain. And granted, we've talked to death about our 5 core assumptions. Denying Genesis being literal does not automatically deny that God exists, but it may be denying that he's good. And the reason that some Christians extrapolate that direction is because it means that death and destruction was inherent in the system that God sets up. Effectively, if you're taking a kind of theistic evolution approach to the history of the world, what you're saying is that at the very beginning, God made everything, but he didn't make life. Billions and billions of years later, who knows how many billions at this point, because with the discoveries of the James Webb Telescope, it could be tens of billions of years now, like many tens of billions of years. But at some point, the Earth came into existence, and then a lightning bolt struck a puddle, and then we have this first organism that crawls out of the ancient ooze. And this thing could just pretty much duplicate itself, and that's about all. But eventually it mutated and then could do a little bit more. And then eventually we had different types of single-celled organisms going around. And then eventually one single-celled organism ate a smaller single-celled organism, but didn't digest it. And somehow the two things started working together. And this whole process of natural selection, of survival of the fittest, of if you survive, good, and if you die, you weren't fit, continues on for billions of years until eventually we get to humankind. And then suddenly the rules change. Rather than continuing on in the system that we're designed for, we set this system aside and are told to live a different way. We don't persecute the poor. We don't kill off the weak. We're supposed to help those in need. We're supposed to love those who hate us, pray for those who persecute us, and to look kindly on the people who cannot look after themselves, and shepherd the weak and the innocent. That is not the system that was originally there from the beginning. And there are a lot of Christians who rightly point out that seems messed up. Why would God say in Genesis death was bad? Which we'll get to in a little bit as we read through Genesis. It does talk about how no animals ate each other. There was no death or destruction or disease. Everything was perfect. So why would God, as an allegory, say that all of that exists, or even weep at the death of Lazarus when he's here as Christ, but then design everything to work so that death has to be present in order for it to work?
Couldn't answer that. I'm not a theistic evolutionist.
Neither am I. But as far as that pertains to people being Christian, do you feel like that is a way of denying God's goodness to say that he set up a system to work on death? He required everything to work on death, and then suddenly changed his mind billions of years into the process after countless trillions of creatures were killed.
And that makes God very flippant. It paints a picture of a God who is less sovereign than he is. No?
I don't know. Right now, it's hard for me to separate some of the points that you were making and connecting it to all of these other ancient Near East creation stories, like the Memphis tablet for the Egyptians. It talks about, gosh, what is their main god? Akim or something like that. And he just all of a sudden became aware of himself and then started creating these mutations that ended up becoming like these lesser gods. And then those lesser gods like started developing and created, gosh, I can't remember the names of them. Like basically lesser gods than that. And then after that, it's humans and animals and stuff like that. So like it follows evolution much more closely than the biblical story and narrative. So right now I'm having a hard time disconnecting that from the other creation stories.
And you're not the only one who's made that connection before, because it's not just the Egyptians. The Babylonians also had their own version of the flood narrative, which we will eventually get to, as well as their own creation myth. And they put the age of the earth at millions of years old, not billions of years old, but they did believe that the earth was considerably older and had a more chaotic look at its creation and the systems that sustain it. So this discussion isn't anything new. I think where a lot of Christians struggle is tying it together with Christianity, with a loving God.
And making it relevant to the family history of the church.
Yes. Now, for myself, I would say that you can absolutely be a Christian and believe that the earth is billions of years old, and simultaneously believe that God is good. The truth is that we all have things that we believe that we don't fully understand. I think for a lot of these people, what they're doing is they're looking at scientific development and they see everything that the scientific community at large has a consensus on. And there is a scientific consensus on this, whether or not it's correct. And they say, all of these smart people are telling me that this is objectively true. If it is objectively true, then that must be what the Bible is saying, because the Bible is true. I understand that. And then from there, they're trying to connect the two and try to make them mesh. The attempts to make them mesh, I don't think work at all. And again, we will get into that as we're exploring Genesis. But I understand why they're making the attempt. However, I think it's misplaced. We can look at human understanding as a way to test the Bible. We can. We can look at archaeology and we can look at human understanding, scientific development, and we can use that to see if the Bible is right. If the Bible makes a claim of truth, we can analyze that claim of truth. The Bible can be wrong in that way. If the Bible's making a claim and it turns out to be wrong. However, at that point, it is no longer the inspired word of God, and that's where we get into the trouble territory. What we need to do is look at the Bible and try to figure out what it's saying before we try to tell it what it's saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's almost like if somebody gives you a book in Hebrew, like we have a Bible sitting in front of us right now that's written in Hebrew. It's an existent language that does make sense and has order and structure to it, but we don't fully understand it. Like, you have to learn how to speak the right language, and there's context to that. So like the context of Genesis and the context of the books that Moses supposedly wrote may be different than what is later in time from the prophets and what is later in time from the New Testament. What God sees from his perspective is going to be different than what man perceives from his perspective. And so you have to be really cautious in your interpretation of something from God's perspective, because we have no idea how God really sees things and what God really thinks. Like it is a language barrier, even if it's translated into English. There is a barrier due to time and translation issue and confusion and maybe even knowledge, like a lack of knowledge, because not everybody is a theologian and a scholar. And so you do have to be very cautious, like you said, Ben, and you have to interpret it through the right lens. And it's not a one size fits all. You don't grab one single magnifying glass. You have a set, and you have to figure out which one is the right one to apply.
It's, especially with more academic textual criticism, hard for people to grasp the depth of the Bible, especially Genesis. There's so many layers in this 150 chapter book that just baffles people. And like one of the reasons why a allegorical view on top of the scientific findings of our time is the like poetic nature of Genesis. And that doesn't mean that it's not literal, but people go straight to that because there is poetic themes in Genesis that are just masterfully woven together, like chiasms. And there's a podcast called Bema Podcast where the first episodes are on Genesis, but he goes through the chiasm, which is basically a structure of poetry where it follows a specific format, like a 1 2 3 3 2 1 or 1 2 3 1 2 3, and all of Genesis up until Abraham follows this format. This doesn't discount it as literal, but people automatically assume that it's poetry because it has poetic themes through it.
The thing about poetry, like if you look at poetry as a genre of literature, not exclusive to the Bible, poetry can be literal. The type of poetry that I write is literal. It's true life experiences that I've translated into a poem, but I don't change it so that my dog is an ant and we're confused about what species I'm talking about. Poetry can be literal.
It can be. And the sad part with this is they'll automatically assume Genesis isn't literal. But the same people who say that will go to Psalms 137, where it talks about bashing the heads of babies in against stones or something like that. Psalms is poetry, but they'll take that as literal. Your God condones breaking heads of babies against rocks. Like, that's not at all what it's saying. It's about a people who just went through that, who are lamenting at what is happening, and not a prescriptive thing. It's a descriptive element and depth of emotion in that. But
David wasn't writing fables.
No.
He was telling his story.
And through the night rode Paul Revere, and through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a voice of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is a poem, and it's about something that happened. Now, granted, there are things in the poem that aren't true. It doesn't mention Dr. Prescott or the other writer who was with Paul Revere, and it talks about the Old North Church being the place where the lanterns are lit and not Christ Church, whatever. The point is that it's meant to convey an event that happened in history. And you can't look at it and say, because it's poetic, it means that Paul Revere didn't do a midnight ride. He did.
We're assuming that it's a Dr. Seuss story, and it's not.
No, poetry was a way to get people to listen, to get people to remember.
It's an art.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful art form like songwriting or painting. But if you think about the mediums that were available, words may have been the only medium they had. And that might have been a gift and a talent for them. And they did a beautiful thing, and it was preserved throughout history, and it doesn't make it fiction.
Yeah, and when you think of even how we learn as children nowadays, and I know we talked a little bit about this with Albert and memorization of literary structures, but like song. And for a culture that was mainly oral starting out, like, why would you not write it in poetry? Why would you not put it in a format that was like, okay, this is much more easier to remember? If we want to remember things in school, at least when I was growing up, you put it in a song.
We literally taught our kids how to remember our address and phone number to the tune of Frere Jacques when they were 2 years old. And if you teach a 2-year-old your phone number and address, just like, hey, this is my address, they're not going to remember it. But if you put it to a song, they will.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that's absolutely 100% what happens, but you can't discount those themes.
No. It's a tool. It's a tool for teaching. Just like the alphabet is a tool for teaching.
So why would people not, as Christians, take it to be actual history? Is there such a weight of evidence against it being history that we have to accept that either the Bible is wrong or it just has to be allegorical?
We could humble ourselves and agree that we don't understand and need to spend more time learning about it. maybe. I don't know. That's radical.
I swear we've discussed this statistic in another episode before, but the Bible is one of the most historically sourced documents in history, and it's over 1,000 times that it's been verified historically, more than any other document, more than any other book, any other writing, even up into much, much more modern times.
And discoveries are still being made.
Yeah.
I think if you're going with the Bible's track record in everything else that has been able to be verified, you have more than enough evidence with that to trust what the Bible says. I think for people, though, the trouble is, okay, but what is the Bible actually saying? Is it vague in what it's saying? Is it not clear that it's meant to be taken literally? At first, I think it would be good to start with some of the reasons for why, because it's one thing to just say the science is overwhelmingly against it. I think it's actually worth explaining why there are a lot of Christians who believe that. The biggest reason why a lot of more well-informed Christians will take the position that it's not literal is because when we look at the layout of the Earth's layers, we have basically 4 different groupings of layers. And we have at the lowest level, it's bedrock. There's nothing in it. It's not sedimentary rock. And so there's no life down at that level. As you go up, getting closer and closer to today, you find different separations of rocks and different rock layers. You all have probably heard of Cambrian or Jurassic or Triassic or Cretaceous or whatever. Those are actually rock layers, and rock layers that are tied with specific time periods that are believed to have happened at some point in our past. What you find as you go through these different layers is that they are sedimentary rock layers. Sedimentary rock is rock that is deposited as sediment through one of a few different methods. A common way would be a flood or something. There's a whole bunch of water, it rains down, and then creates this kind of pulp, this rock pulp, and it washes over and covers over things and then solidifies as time goes on with pressure and time. That's a bit of an oversimplification. There's the igneous and metamorphic rock too. We don't need to make this a geological class. But basically, these sedimentary rocks are the only things that you can find fossils in. And as we go through these different layers of sedimentary rock, what we find is there are different kinds of fossils. At the lowest level, we find pretty much exclusively very small sea life. As we go up further, we find larger, more complicated sea life. Eventually, we find the first land animals, and they're very small, and then we get to more complicated, larger land animals. We don't find human beings throughout any of these different layers. And then eventually we get to the highest levels, which do happen to have humans very high up, ridiculously high up. And so if you're looking at all of this, and you're thinking, okay, so it doesn't seem like all of these rock layers relate at the same time. The layout and the makeup of each of these types of rock is different. So it seems like these things had to be deposited at different times in Earth's history. What's more is that you find different types of decaying elements in these layers. There's a very common type of dating method for older rocks. There's potassium argon dating. There's uranium lead dating. I know there's a lot of technical information here, but basically the idea is that pretty much every element on the periodic table is trying to become a noble gas. So the noble gases are completely stable, 100%. Everything else is trying to become them. There are certain elements that are more unstable than others and will decay into other elements pretty easily and readily. Those elements are much more stable. For uranium, it's trying to become lead. And so when you find deposits of uranium and lead together, you can assume all of it at one time was probably uranium and eventually became lead. And it takes a very long time for uranium to decay into lead. So you can say, okay, assuming this whole deposit started with uranium, we have only a certain amount of uranium now and a certain amount of lead. It must have taken X number of years for it to become lead. Doing that throughout all these different rock layers with potassium argon and uranium lead gives very old ages for these rock layers, assuming that these deposits came into being at the same time these rock layers formed, which is not unreasonable. Taking all of these assumptions in place, it does seem like there's very strong evidence that the Earth is very old. You also look at other things like the movement of plate tectonics. It does look like you can move all of the different continents together, but the continents are moving very slowly. Once again, you walk that back, it took a very long time for the continents to get to where they're at.
Pangea.
Yes. It's not as if there are a bunch of just low faith ignoramuses who are trying to ruin Christianity. I think that there are a lot of people I've talked about, like Dr. John Lennox. I love Dr. John Lennox. He's an incredible man. And he does believe in theistic evolution because he's a scientist and he's involved in these different groups of people. And to him, I think the evidence just seems so overwhelming that there's no way that the Bible should be taken any other way. But once again, that seems to be taken the position that because what we look at is true, because this interpretation is true, therefore it must be what the Bible is saying. That's looking at things backwards. You have to first determine what the Bible is saying and then test what the Bible is saying. And if what the Bible really was saying is false, then the Bible is false. So, there are other people who take a scientific approach, guys like Dr. Andrew Snelling, Dr. Steve Austin, Dr. Kurt Weiss, and they look at all of this information and they have a completely different interpretation. They believe that all of these things came into existence during the flood of Noah, that effectively all of these layers of sediment were deposited at once over this basically year period where the flood happened. And there's a lot of exploration of this. There's a movie called Is Genesis History, which is really good, and I recommend everybody check it out. And it provides just a tiny, 15-minute glimpse into a bunch of different scientists who believe in creationism. And they have dedicated their expertise to proving it, basically. They look at the Bible and see if they can prove what it says. There are two different sides of this that are scientific. And if you're going to try to make your beliefs based purely on what science says, I'm sorry, but you're not going to have a very easy time of it. That should not be the reason for your belief in Genesis one way or the other, because there's enough evidence going both directions to take you both directions. The question on my mind is, what does the Bible actually say? What is God telling us? How does he claim the earth came into existence?
And why does that matter for our faith walk? Whether we believe one way or the other, why is it important that we determine that? Why does God care that we know that?
And there is the verse in Revelation to the Laodiceans that talks about them forgetting who their creator was.
I can tell you off the top of my head a handful of reasons why this first couple of verses of Genesis are very important, but I don't know.
What I would say to that is what Peter said to that, because oddly enough, he does address this.
Thank God for Peter.
This is 2 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 3. Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming?" he promised. Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's words, the heavens came into being and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are preserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly.
And what was that verse?
2 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 3. And I don't remember all the verses that I read. I'm sorry. But the point is that Peter is calling back to the creation of the world. There are people who deliberately forget. Those are his words. Who want to set aside what it is that God has said, the way that he says he made things. I want to know how God did this, and I want to believe what God said, regardless of how stupid it makes me look, or if anyone believes me or anyone believes him. That's what I want, and I want to start with what he says. But there's a lot of seeming pride and bluster to that. Is there a way for us to know that's the way that it's meant to be taken? Is it clear in the text that God meant for us to take it literally?
I don't think, when I think about practical application, I think the creation story, the 6 days creation, is more of a roadmap for us in our lives than it is a history lesson. The Sabbath is one of the very first things mentioned. God's handiwork and toil is one of the very first things mentioned. The Trinity is one of the very first things hinted at. God's goodness is one of the very first things hinted at. There are a lot of structural truths in those few verses that are very applicable to today. And it doesn't really matter if we agree that it's 6 literal days or not, because we live in a 7-day week. And somehow those words were preserved, knowing where we would end up from the beginning of time to today. I don't know. It's very powerful.
As far as whether or not we can know what God intended,
Have the mind of Christ.
I think that God actually did make it pretty clear the way we were supposed to take this. And we can actually find that both in the Gospel of Luke and in Genesis chapter 5. So if you go to Genesis chapter 5, starting at verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered his son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. This goes on and on. This is the genealogy provided in Genesis. This same genealogy is provided in Luke, connecting Christ all the way back to Adam. Luke chapter 3, verse 23. The header is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Matha, and it goes along for a ways. And you get to verse 38. So this is Luke chapter 3, verse 38. The son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Luke seems to be under the impression that the genealogy provided in Genesis is genuine, that it's meant to reflect the history of the world. Do we say that Luke didn't know what he was talking about? Or do we say that, okay, maybe there was an Adam, but he wasn't the first man? It says here that he's the son of God.
I've never heard Adam wasn't the first man. And there's most theistic evolution believe in a first man.
There had to be a first man at some point.
Yeah, being Adam. And there's a book on it that's pretty good that I enjoyed called The Genealogical Adam by Swami Das.
The trouble is that if you were to ascribe the number of traditional human years to these people rather than the hundreds of years that we find in Genesis, and we'll get to that in a second too, there actually isn't that much time, because it says that Adam was about 130 years old, or when he had Seth, I think. And if you say, actually, no, he was like in his 20s or something. Okay, so then we go with 20-year generations. Well, there really wasn't that much time until the flood. And then there really wasn't that much time after the flood until any major biblical event. It drastically reduces the amount of time that you have to work with in a biblical timetable. So you can't say that he actually was the first man, because you're still operating off of a time frame of thousands of years. So that would be to say that we didn't have Neanderthals and humans living together hundreds of thousands of years ago, like theistic evolutionists do believe.
Not all of them, though.
I know there are diverse sections even in there, but the tough thing is that you're trying to gel science with what's written in the Bible. Either you believe that Adam lived about between 6,000 and 7,000 years. Again, there's a variety there, based on whether you go with what the Septuagint says or what the Masoretic texts say. But you believe somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago was when Adam was born, created by God.
He wasn't born.
He was made.
He's the only man without a belly button. Come on.
Maybe he had one regardless. I don't know. But yeah, either you think he came into existence between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, or you don't. In which case, what the Bible says is objectively false. And there's no way to gel what Luke and Genesis say with theistic evolution. I'm sorry, there's not.
You mean science could be wrong?
It depends on the science that you're using. Like I said, there are guys like Dr. Andrew Snelling who are very smart, and that he's a capable physicist, and he lines out a lot of reasons for why he believes scientifically the Bible, the way that the history in the Bible is presented, is right. But he could be wrong on the things that he says. I don't know. I don't believe what Genesis says based on science. I don't. And this may sound strange coming from a guy whose background is in physics. But one, I only have a bachelor's in it, so make of that what you will. But
don't lie to the people, okay? You show up in a lab coat every time.
I do mad science, Gina. I'm a mad scientist. I'm mad. Delightfully. But I don't think that's the reason anyone should specifically believe it. And granted, there are people who came to the faith specifically because of the scientific evidence. There was actually one guy, I wish I could remember his name, but he was a man who studies rivers and streams and their development, and he traveled the globe. And he used to be an atheist, and what he found was he saw that there was a lot of evidence for a global flood. And he didn't make any allusions to Genesis. He was an atheist at the time, but he told the scientific community, I believe there was a global flood. And they threw him out because now this is too close to Genesis jargon. We don't believe any of that.
It's almost like science doesn't want the Bible to be true.
There are a lot of scientists, absolutely, who...
Popular ones.
Yes. Very popular scientists who do not want the Bible to be true. It is true. That is the case. And there's a lot of kind of cultish fervor when you get into the sciences. A lot of gatekeeping, a lot of people who do get treated horribly if they have an opinion that goes against the grain. So
then you get fact checked and canceled.
Basically, yes.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. But it is true. And so you do have to keep that in mind when you're hearing not just scientific. I've been in the sciences long enough. I was a part of them long enough to know that they get things wrong all the time. And there are fundamental things that they disagree on openly with one another, but won't publish in a book.
We've also lived through COVID now, so we know that everybody in a white lab coat is not necessarily honest with us.
An expert, that's really more subjective than we think.
Back when I worked as an industrial electrician, there were people who constantly said, I've been doing this for 30 years. And they were idiots. They couldn't do a thing right, and you had to go in and fix everything they ever did because they were terrible at their jobs. It's the same in the sciences. There are people who coast off of one singular contribution to their field, which they barely did anything for. And they never make any contributions more than that, and they just stay as that doctor for a very long time. As it turns out, it's very easy to get a doctorate. You just have to know what to do. A lot of people get doctorates by finding one thing that's false and proving it false. It's not hard.
The whole scientific method is like making a hypothesis, so like guessing, and then making assumptions based on that, trying to prove it.
I wouldn't bash the scientific method because as it turns out...
I'm not bashing it.
I know what you mean, but the scientific method was actually developed from a religious standpoint. Both Cambridge and Oxford were once monasteries. A lot of people don't realize this. But it was in these monasteries that the scientific method was developed, and it was developed specifically to test the Bible, which is what we're talking about. They believed that God was a God of order, and that order must be reflected then in the universe he created. And so while they started out testing things in the Bible to see if they could interpret it correctly, they took that system of interpretation and applied it outwardly. And they said the same system that we use to test the Bible should be used to test the world around us. And they were correct. The world does operate off of rules that you can understand. And through an understanding of those rules, you can predict things and you can make the world work in your favor. But you can go too far with that understanding. Mostly what science is very good in this realm, because we're talking about something that can't be tested, which is the past. We're going more into history than we are into science. What science can do is collect data points, and then it's on human beings to interpret those data points. And human beings are fallible.
What? We're made in the image of God.
So that's exactly why you can get the different rock layers, and you can have a guy like Snelling say, yeah, this very clearly indicates that there's a very young Earth and it was all deposited at the same time. Relative ages, not absolute ages, and so on. And then you can have other scientists who are like, well, yes, but actually it's very clear that these are very, like me, ache my bones. They say that exactly like that. I've heard it so many times. Where do you go from there?
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.